Hello there. Today we're going to be looking at a different period to our normal focus on the ancient world and the Romans in particular. Now this video should be posted on Wednesday the 18th of June 2025. Now that makes it the 210th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. Now as most of you will know, I have an interest, a deep interest in that era of Regency England, Napoleonic France, and the great conflicts that were waged, all the things that, in a sense, Jane Austen left out. So when you were reading those at school, you knew this grand war was going on in the background, but they didn't really talk about it very much. And as a boy, you were desperate to find out more about that. So I've got my series so far of 6 novels set in the Peninsular War with a fictional regiment, the 106th. The aim was always to get them to Waterloo via lots more in Portugal and Spain, southern France, Canada, possibly in Central Europe and this sort of thing. There's quite a lot more to explore that is less familiar to the wider audience, but is fascinating in its detail. The publisher pulled the plug after the 6th novel, which goes up to the Battle of Albuera in 1811. I still hope one day to continue that series because I'm frustrated and I want to know, while I've got character arcs and lots of things in mind, novels like that tend to throw up surprises. Your characters start doing things almost on their own and you find yourself writing and the story just seems to flow. One day, hopefully that will happen, but it means persuading a publisher to take the books on. So who knows, if the 6 are still in print, there are audiobooks coming later this year, which hopefully will give them a bit of a boost. If that picks up enough, then somebody will be convinced that commercially this is a good idea. But anyway, today we're not talking about fiction, we're talking about history. And I thought it would be worth looking at the Waterloo campaign, the 100 days as it's known, from Napoleon's return from exile and his restoration of power in France, the campaign that followed in Belgium, and then the subsequent invasion of France by the Allied armies, focused around the Battle of Waterloo. Waterloo was the decisive moment of all this. And I thought we'd look a little bit about the story itself and emphasize some of the things that perhaps people don't always think about in that way. Now, I've not written non-fiction on this era. I don't know whether I ever shall. There's a book on Wellington's army and its development that I think is there in the back of my mind, bubbling away. But whether I'll get around to it, whether anybody will let me write it, I don't know. We'll have to see. I want to look at that campaign. I want to try and analyze it, and in some ways use the same sort of approach that we've used when we've been looking at the generalship of a Caesar or a Pompey or a Mark Antony, a Crassus, a Hannibal, and look in the same sort of way, ask the same sort of questions for a period where we have much better evidence, but where we'll find there are also things that we don't fully understand and where we have to guess, so that it's a useful expansion of that sort of analysis that we do in other videos on our main period, our main focus of the ancient world. I don't know how many people are familiar with the story. I would guess a fair proportion of the people who watch these videos will be. Others may not be, so I'll try and cover the basics. This won't be a blow-by-blow detailed account because there isn't time to do that, and I'm sure there must be others out there on YouTube. There's certainly plenty of very good books. I'll list a few in the notes section on this video. So we'll do the familiar stuff, but we'll also try and look at it in a slightly different way. There's a danger with something like Waterloo that it all takes on this air of inevitability, and the story becomes very familiar. And those who study the period in detail and who look at the sources, hopefully, I'm going to have to see, but hopefully we can get Gareth Glover on to talk about his work on finding and publishing new or forgotten source material for the era in general, and all the things that's pointed out. One of his key conclusions is that the classic account of Waterloo really develops in the decades afterwards and in the early Victorian era. And then after that, for a long time, nobody really challenges it. But you end up relying on information from people who weren't there and ignoring some of the information from people who were. We won't be able to go in great detail into the personal accounts aspect today because we're trying to look at the bigger picture. We will do more on that later on. As I say, hopefully we'll get Gareth on to talk about it. So let's look at the situation. In 1815, Napoleon has returned from his first exile, having been deposed in 1814, as it's really the consequences of things going pear-shaped for him in the last few years. He'd been so successful in the early period when he'd, the Austerlitz campaign and beyond, and the Jena-Auerstadt in Prussia, and then a tougher but eventually the defeat of the Russians in 1807. Renewal of war with Austria in 1809. The Peninsular War, this big, what was meant to be a sideshow, what was meant to be something that was fairly simple and over quickly, ended up sucking in huge numbers of French troops, disproportionate to any gain from the occupation of Spain and the attempted occupation of Portugal. A drain on manpower, a drain on resources. Men and horses died in great numbers in the Peninsular War. They were used up, and most of them not by battle, but by the arduous nature of the campaign. Essentially, the population, or large parts of the population of Spain, just wouldn't give in and wouldn't quit. And no matter how disrupted and chaotic the government would become, and the different juntas in various areas, enough people just kept fighting that the French could never concentrate, and the combination of not just the little war of the guerrillas, the partisans, but the Spanish armies that kept on reforming and going back into battle one more time, in spite of all the costly disasters that occurred. They just wouldn't quit. And the ability to get them going again, combined with the presence of Wellington's Anglo-Portuguese army, that meant that the French could never concentrate enough men to defeat Wellington, nor could they have enough people to occupy and control all of Spain. So that combination drained things. That was a weakness. However, it took the bigger disasters of particularly the Russian campaign. In 1812, when Napoleon leads, depending on the figures you use, between 500, 600,000 men in an invasion of Russia, and it goes horribly wrong. Borodino is a slaughterhouse where the French achieve a tactical victory, but strategically it leads to nothing. And then the huge losses, of men, horses, equipment. Even the survivors are often in a very poor physical state and probably mental state as well. You look at somebody like Marshal Ney and you have to wonder if he's got the equivalent of what would have been called shell shock in the First War. He's never quite the same man after 1812, in spite, given what he's gone through, leading the rear guard, last man out, all that sort of thing, firing a musket. It's not really surprising, but it's the huge losses that have accumulated in these campaigns. Even the great victories were expensive, and by the time you've got to 1809 and the Wagram campaign, all that sort of thing, they're getting very, very costly indeed. Russia is far more costly and a defeat. From then on, Napoleon will fight in 1813, and you will have those bitter campaigns fought in Germany primarily, leading to Leipzig and the great defeat there. The biggest battle that's occurred in Europe up to this point, as far as we can tell, spread over several days, immense losses, and again, it's a French defeat. It's not the end of Napoleon's resources and his ability to fight on, and he shows that remarkable capacity to reorganize, raise more troops, organize, get things going in the Napoleonic state. But by 1814, you're facing the invasion of France. The numbers are against you, and no matter how many clever things you do, you can't win enough battles to turn the tide back. So eventually he is forced to abdicate. He's sent into exile on the island of Elba and given a small guard, about a 1,000 Old Guard, Grenadiers and Chasseurs, a squadron of Polish Lancers of the Guard, plus a staff, but not really watched too closely. He's able, months later, to return. Louis XVIII has been restored to power, the Bourbon monarch, but he and his court are completely out of kilter with French society and French politics, and particularly upset the army that has been the centerpiece, the glorious victors of the Napoleonic era. There's that great celebration of, often, interestingly enough, using very Roman imagery. No coincidence, Napoleon's been consul before he's emperor. You have eagle standards given to the regiments, well, battalions and squadrons initially, but then regiments later on. That celebration, you know, this is the new Caesar, this is the man who could do anything, and winning. And through their victories, France has been able to exploit resources of a large part of Europe. And the economy has become based around victory and conquest, successful war making, to support larger war making that again needs to be successful to keep you going. Eventually, virtually all the other major powers have allied against Napoleon, and it's that coalition in 1814, you know, Wellington invading across the Pyrenees into southern France, the Russians, the Prussians, the Austrians, the Bavarians, the Swedes, so many other smaller states as well being involved in the defeat of France, that essentially the numbers are so heavily against him that it's hard to see how he could have won. Yet it's also interesting to note that in 1813 in particular, on several occasions, Napoleon is offered reasonably favourable terms for peace, particularly before the Austrians have joined in, and turns them down thinking that he can do better. You know, there's the gambler within Napoleon, the sense that trusting in his own genius, his own talent, his ability to win these remarkable victories, that he will be able to win a bigger one and therefore turn things around and get an even better deal than the one that's on offer. In fact, it doesn't turn out that way. But that's quite important for when we look at 1815 and we look at the Waterloo campaign, because there's that same mentality. So Napoleon returns, you know, there's that famous passage from the Moniteur, I think it is, you know, how he's the Corsican ogre, the rebel, when he arrives, and then eventually the emperor arrives in Paris as they change, as fortune goes his way. The army in particular welcomed him back. Other aspects of the state that had done well under him were at least willing to give him the benefit of the doubt this time. It shows how much the Bourbon regime had upset people in a very short time, but it was the army in particular that welcomed him. And it was the army he was going to need. Napoleon obviously proclaimed that he wanted to live at peace with all the other powers of Europe and Great Britain. You know, Great Britain was always the obsession, partly because the rivalry between Britain and France throughout the earlier part of the 18th century, and Napoleon had grown up with the sense that Frenchmen felt Britain was the great enemy. And you can see in the same way that there are aspects of the Nazis' behaviour and strategy that does hark back to the pre-First World War German aims. There is a lot of continuity in what Napoleon does with French aims beforehand, and the idea of economically supplanting Britain as the sort of the great trading power lies behind the continental system. It didn't spring from the air. It didn't just spring from a bright idea Napoleon had. There were roots to this. As there were roots, he developed military ideas, drills, strategy, concepts of how you fought a war, and Napoleon just took them to a much, much higher level and carried them out with a flair, an imagination, and a skill and a luck that others had not been able to do, partly because of concentrating all that power in his own hands. Napoleon is naive if he thinks that anybody is going to accept him as emperor back and not fight a war against him, because they've only just beaten him before, and that took the combined efforts of Britain and all of Europe. You know, the manpower that had to be deployed to defeat France and invade France and depose Napoleon was immense, and the cost of all that, those people had to be clothed, they had to be equipped, they had to be fed, they had to be paid. Even if they weren't fed very well, they weren't paid very well in many cases, nevertheless, this was a huge expense. Everybody was exhausted, spiritually as well as financially, and often in terms of manpower. And they'd all been rushing to demobilize after the defeat of Napoleon in 1814. So it's one of those things, nobody really wants a war, but also none of the European powers can really imagine Napoleon sitting quiet forever. You know, it's convenient for Napoleon to be at peace now. He doesn't want to fight a war straight away. But the whole basis of the Napoleonic system was war and conquest. Napoleon would have to have changed dramatically in his aims and find a new system that could work for France whilst also satisfying all the old soldiers who rallied back to him very, very quickly, particularly the officers, the NCOs, those groups that are vital in military terms, but the ones who've done really well under the old system, who have been the heroes and who've enjoyed it and who have felt that they've taken on the rest of the world and for a long time beaten it. You know, there are good reasons why they're so confident. So there is no real chance that anyone's going to accept Napoleon's peace overtures and just let him there, because basically what you're doing, as everyone would see it, is allowing him to build up his military strength until he's far stronger, when he's going to start doing what he did before and just picking you off one by one or attacking you. And look what it took in 1814 to defeat him. That's after the disaster, after what the Russians had done to him in 1812, after the fighting of 1813, and he was still going strong and winning some battles, at least tactical victories, in 1814. You know, he did not quit easily, and it took all those resources to defeat him. Nobody wants that to happen again. So the feeling is that, well, we've got to beat him, and we've got to beat him quickly. So time is a major factor. It's background to all of this, and it's, you know, it turns out to be the 100 days, and it's all resolved in just over 3 months. But that was always Napoleon in particular is racing against the clock, because all of Europe has decided, the old coalition, in spite of all the bickering that they've had at the Conference of Vienna, where they've been trying to sort out what to do with Europe. And remember, these are states that are naturally rivals. You know, the Prussians, the Austrians, the Russians, and the British don't like and trust each other. They have not been natural allies. They became allies because of revolutionary Napoleonic France being perceived as a greater threat than anything else. But they have conflicting interests, ambitions, desires that mean it isn't natural for them to work together. And it's an indication of just how far Napoleon scared everybody. And the thought of a France led by Napoleon and strong again terrifies absolutely everybody, that they agree so quickly to combine forces and to fight against the French. However, everybody's been so relieved at the end of fighting in 1814 that they have begun demobilization of their armies on a large scale. Britain, because Britain is a democracy, has done it faster than anybody else. You know, democracies are like that. Bear in mind, income tax is introduced in this period to pay for the war. And Britain, we tend to focus, obviously, because this is the Waterloo campaign, on the army. But remember the immense expense of the Navy. The Royal Navy, as it's become, is huge and very, very costly to maintain, because ships are expensive to build. They're even more expensive to crew and maintain, and they wear out. And the basis has always been Britain as an island. You know, it's the old cliche of I can't remember which First Lord of the Admiralty it was, talking about, could Napoleon invade? Well, you know, I don't know whether he will invade or not and how he might come. I can just say he's not going to come by sea. That security, things like Trafalgar had confirmed, meant that Britain could keep in the struggle in a way, because Napoleon simply couldn't reach them. Hence the continental system in part as well, and trying to isolate them that way, though, as I say, there are roots to all of that. But the Navy is immensely expensive. Again, you've been trying to run that down after 1814, at least once the American War was over, because the Navy has been stretched. Wellington's army, under Sir John Moore as well at that point, but a British army, a British presence in the peninsula was only possible because of the might of the Navy that could supply it, but could also, if necessary, take it off, evacuate it, so we didn't lose the entire army, because that's the only one Britain's ever going to have. They've done it at Corunna with Sir John Moore. There were ships waiting off Lisbon in 1810 when Marshal Massena attacked the lines of Torres Vedras. You know, Wellington was relying on those to stop the French, and they did, in combination with the scorched earth policy, but there were ships there. This was only possible and politically possible if there were ships waiting to take the British troops away if the worst came to the worst. It didn't, but they were there. So the Navy's been stretched. The army is the big target. Normally, other than when they'd committed to Spain and Portugal, you know, Britain, if you look back to the 7 Years' War, if you look back to Marlborough and before, it's always avoided big armies on the continent. It's relied very much on allies. The Navy has been the big thing. The army has been dotted around the empire, but it's not deployed in huge numbers. You know, when you think A battle like Borodino, there's between 100 and 150,000 men on each side. The British on their own simply can't muster that sort of army, let alone concentrate it in one place. So Britain has demobilized, but it's also true of Prussia, Russia, Austria, the big players and the smaller players, Bavaria and the like. Most people will need a long time to get their armies back together. It's not just a question of whether or not you've demobilized the troops, it's the supply system. It's the logistics that allow these armies to operate. And operate, when you think, particularly from, say, a Russian perspective, to project your army, to send it all the way to the borders of France, those are immense distances. And even if you're going through Allied territory and you have help, there's still a lot you've got to organize and you've got to supply, and you need the baggage animals and the draft animals and the wagons, and you need the supplies for them to carry, both food and all the other things, the powder, the shot, the replacement boots, equipment, uniforms, all the things an army needs. So it's going to take time for the ones who'd been the big players in 1814 to actually arrive. The Prussians are a bit more switched on, a bit closer, a bit more organized. They are able to send Blücher and concentrate an army in Belgium, in the Low Countries, the Kingdom of the Netherlands it now is, fairly quickly, and build that up to the point where it's going to be one of the main factors in this campaign. But even then, it's always interesting, Blücher has no cuirassiers, none of the really heavy cavalry. He's got dragoons, but he's got an army that, like the entire Prussian army, we'll come back to this, relies very heavily on reservists, on older men, landwehr units, all this sort of thing. But the Prussians are able to get themselves organized and have an army that's ready to take the field right at the beginning. Britain, or more accurately Britain and its allies, with Wellington appointed to command, are able to do the same. Again, it's a question of proximity. Britain is closer. Britain had some troops in the Netherlands at the start because they'd been campaigning there in 1814, and these were quickly reinforced. And it was a lot quicker to get them there. It's interesting, Wellington at one point expressed the desire he would have loved to have had Portuguese troops to serve with him, because they had been so essential a part, basically a third or more of his army, and very, very reliable in the Peninsular War. And they'd been integrated into the British system, into the British divisions. They'd worked very well together. After some teething troubles, but essentially it worked very well. But there's no real prospect within the time that this isn't going to happen quickly. Even if the Portuguese government is willing, it's going to take time for this to happen. The same is true of just building up the army generally. In April, when Wellington takes over, there's a relatively small force. You've got a newly organized army of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, a mixture of Dutch and Belgian regiments. You've got Hanoverian troops coming in. You've got Brunswickers. You've got the Nassau contingent that's largely counted as part of the Netherlands army. So you have lots of different nationalities. The key thing about most of these other forces, with the exception of the King's German Legion, that's predominantly Hanoverian, but has been serving as part of the British Army for well over a decade, everyone else has been organised, raised within the last 12 months or so, and often less than that. These are all new formations. Nassau is a little bit of an exception. One regiment, I can't remember if it's the first or the second, has served with the French throughout most of the Peninsular War before deserting en masse, and largely its manpower is the same. The other regiment that had also served with the French, most of the men within it are relatively new recruits, and other units it's the same. So you have a mixture of people within these groups. Hanover has been occupied by the French for a long time, so there hasn't been a Hanoverian army until you reform it. You have a small number of officers who've served before the French took over, but then haven't seen service for the best part of 20 years. You've got others who have seen service, but it's with the French. And although there are understandable doubts about the loyalty of these men, on the whole, the men who served under the French, whether they're in Belgian, Dutch, or other units, they do very well. They perform very well. They are experienced. They prove to be amongst the pick of the officers you've got. But you can quite understand suspicion about which way they might go because they've been on the other side so recently. So there will 2 armies will be formed by June in the Netherlands, in this area. You've got Blücher's Prussians, starts off with about 130,000 men, nearly 300, well, just over 300 guns. But it's not quite the Prussian army of a year or so before. Again, because of this, the sort of peace dividend, as modern politicians would have called it, your ability to suddenly spend less and get rid of your army because hopefully you won't need it for a while, but now suddenly, unfortunately, you do. One of the big issues is, of course, the conference at Vienna has been reorganizing the map of Europe. Prussia has got control of Saxony, but there are problems. There's a significant Saxon contingent within Blücher's army who mutiny. And just weeks before the campaign begins, 14,000 men have to be sent home because he just can't rely on them. There's that feeling. And there are lots of problems. This is not... There is a great danger that you just think, oh, this is the Prussian army. This is the army that you've got people like Clausewitz serving in it, but this is the army where suddenly they've been beaten in 1806 and they've realized they've got to get their act together. So they change from a sort of stagnated version of Frederick the Great's way of fighting. They take the best of that, they combine it, and they create the wonderful Prussian General Staff, which will morph into the German General Staff, the German way of war making, which will prove so efficient later in the 19th and into the 20th centuries. There is a tendency to see that as a flick of a switch. Suddenly, all that's happened. Instead, this is the really early days. The Prussians are learning. So they were starting during the peace after 1806 and then the build-up to their renewal of war in 1813. They were starting to lay the basis for that military doctrine, that military system, which really was a codification of best practice for themselves and everybody before then. Again, it's not just, oh, this is a brilliant idea, sprung from nothing, and here it is, fully formed, fully fledged, and off we go. The Prussian army is now fabulous. It is improving. It is becoming more efficient in its staff work. The big advantage, particularly once the main force of Saxons has gone, it's a largely homogeneous army, even though obviously there are other distinct regions within it, and units tend to be recruited on those bases of, Westphalians and others, and Silesians and all the different groups. But this is an army that's still learning. And then you have Blücher, who's in his 70s, Gneisenau as his chief of staff, who proved to be a very good combination. Blücher there is that tradition, and it lasts again into the Second World War, of the German commander who is just very, very aggressive and hurls everything at the enemy as quickly as possible and tries to outwit him, tries to sort of be more violent and faster than the enemy and beat them that way. And, there's an aspect where even Rommel is of that sort of doctrine. Blücher is that. Gneisenau is more of the planner, more of the organizer. It's homogeneous. The staff system is it's certainly better than the army that Wellington will have at this time, that he's been able to put together in the time, because it's, again, everybody comes from the same system, but it's far from perfect. This is not the idealized, but nevertheless highly efficient Prussian come German army of later generations. It's moving in that direction, but it isn't there yet. And it isn't the pick of the bunch. You haven't got guard units, you haven't got cuirassiers, you haven't got your really heavy cavalry, you haven't got a lot of stuff that you'd had a year or so before when you were fighting to invade France. Because again, Prussia's exhausted and it takes time to organize that. So there will be more Prussian troops coming later, but not for weeks, perhaps months, and they'll start to arrive when the Russians and the Austrians and all the others turn up. So alongside Blücher's army, you've got Wellington's army, which by the time the campaign begins, numbers about 112,000, just over 200 guns, of which between a quarter and a third are British, even including the KGL. It's not the army Wellington had in 1814. It's not his army that he shaped around himself with commanders that know how he works, know what he wants, and generally speaking, will do what they're told. It's most of the troops are unfamiliar. You know, he's not had anything to do with many of these contingents with the Dutch, the Belgians. You've got, for political reasons, the Prince of Orange had been in command, now becomes commander of Wellington, creates a couple of corps. He's young, he's in his 20s, he's brave. You get a lot of, you know, very impassioned views of the Prince of Orange, many of them critical, particularly from the British side. He probably does about as well as you could expect. He's served on the staff for a few years in the Peninsular War, but he's never commanded a unit. He's not a military genius. He isn't one of those people who can just be given an army and by some miracle seems to be able to know what to do with it. He tries his best. He certainly was inspirational. You can get the accounts where, you know, he often does go there and inspire the troops, but he did make some bad decisions. But also, you know, he probably did, as again, did his best. His chief of staff, Rebecque, is a capable man, and at one critical moment ignores Wellington's orders, but does what proves to be the right thing and makes all that happens later on possible. But the point is that you have a separate army, the Dutch-Belgian army. They're trying to integrate those two different groups. You know, the Belgians are, and will prove within a few years, not to be too keen on being part of you know, a Dutch kingdom. Then you've got the Brunswickers, you've got the Hanoverians. Wellington's aim was to try and do something that rather like his Peninsular army, where he'd integrated the Portuguese and eventually some units of Spanish as well into the army. And they were all under his command. He could rely upon all of them. But politically, that's impossible. These contingents aren't going to do that. He does manage to allocate Hanoverian brigades to British divisions, but everybody else remains in separate formations. This corps structure is created, but it's noticeable that as the campaign goes on, and this is only a matter of days, by Waterloo, he's pretty much, the corps system has been thrown out the window, and he's breaking the units up by brigade, often rather than division, and mixing them together so that more reliable, more experienced units are next to the inexperienced ones and so on. Many of the inexperienced ones are sheltered in second or third line, this sort of thing. He's trying to do that sense where, and that's partly why he's rushing around even more than usual to control everything, because he's taken out the higher level command structure. The corps structure, such as it was, doesn't really do anything. So he's going and giving orders directly to battalion commanders, but often to brigade commanders and in some cases divisional commanders. But you'll notice how that direct intervention it's a feature of Wellington's command style all the way through, but it is much stronger at Waterloo. And there's always a tendency, because Waterloo is the famous battle and the one that, you know, I started reading about first before I read about the Peninsular War, and I'd seen the movie Waterloo and all this sort of thing, that you see Wellington at Waterloo as typical rather than adapting to a different situation, and also bringing along the experience he's had from the campaigns in Portugal and Spain earlier on. But all told, if you put the two Allied armies together, you know, they've got 230,000, 220,000. It's hard to get reliable figures. You've obviously got to take out the Saxon contingent that's sent home, several hundred guns. You know, this is a large force, but while the Prussian army is fairly coherent, Wellington's Allied army is not. It's learning as it goes along, and you have units arriving at the very last minute from most of the contingents. You've got, for instance, the brigade that marches and arrives on the 18th and takes part in Waterloo. You've got other units. The 43rd Foot were in transports off the coast, weren't landed in time to take part, having been sent off to America. So one of the key units of the Light Division throughout the Peninsular War doesn't get its Waterloo clasp because they're not present on the day. I remember there was a documentary not too long ago about the Falklands War that described it as a typically British lash-up. Wellington's army fits that category very much, though you could argue actually that it's not just a British lash-up, it's a Dutch-Belgian one, it's a Brunswick one. Everybody is throwing together, everybody, because Napoleon has returned so suddenly, because he's forming an army so quickly, and because everybody has decided we've got to fight him, all sides are rushing to do things. They do not have the time to prepare properly. So they're improvising, they're doing their best, they're trying to get ready as best they can, but this is not a clash between well-organized, proven armies that have fought alongside each other for a long time and know what they're doing under the same commanders. These are very inexperienced, still rather clumsy. And that will be a feature all the way through, that there are plenty of mistakes made by all of the three main players and their armies in the 100 Days campaign. So the Allied war effort is very much improvised, it's being organised on the hoof, and it's taking time. The longer you have, the more you can improve, the more you can start to train up the vast majority of your troops that are very inexperienced, but also integrate the command structure of all the different contingents. The biggest problem is faced by Wellington because it's such an international, such a multinational army. And it's largely unfamiliar. Even a lot of the British troops are ones that haven't served under him before. He doesn't have a lot of his Peninsular War commanders. He's got Uxbridge in charge of the cavalry, who hasn't served in the Peninsula since the retreat to Corunna. Largely, I mean, there's obviously the fact that he'd eloped with the wife of one of Wellington's brothers. You know, there was difficulty there in that scandal. But more important than that was the fact that he was so senior in the army list that if he'd gone back to the Peninsular War, he would have had to be given probably an infantry division or even a larger command than that. Again, we'll talk about that another day, because it's quite interesting how commanders were selected within the British system. That is useful for thinking about for when we come to how we analyse the Romans and other armies in different periods. So people don't always do it in quite the way we might think. So Uxbridge is there, he's second in command, he's effective commander of the Allied cavalry. Wellington's got far more cavalry than he's ever had in the Peninsular War, but it's many of them are units that have not served abroad for a long time. The cavalry is predominantly British and KGL. The Dutch Belgians contribute a lot. The Brunswickers, a regiment hussars and a squadron of Ulan. The Hanoverian mounted contingent doesn't do terribly well. There's only one regiment at Waterloo that, barring a group, they suffer about 50 casualties. Some of them probably do stay and fight, but the rest just gallop away and aren't too interested. So you have lots of troops that he doesn't know, lots of leaders he doesn't know. Linguistic problems, you know, not everybody speaks the same language. They've got different systems of drill. Some units are adopting, some contingents rather, adopting British Army drill, but that doesn't always work. They don't always have people to instruct them, and it doesn't necessarily suit the less experienced troops. So there are different solutions. Do you deploy line in 2 deep, 3 deep? Some of the contingents, like the Dutch Belgians, tried to do it in 2 because Prince of Orange being an advocate of the British way of doing things, in that sense, well, that's worked for them. You could argue that the debate had always been that for less experienced troops, the extra rank, that little bit more depth, gave a solidity to the line that experienced, well-drilled troops didn't need, but that your rawer troops did, and therefore made your lines a little more brittle than they might have been. Lots of things like that. There's a lot going on. It is a very complicated task. Now, for Napoleon, it's similar in many ways, but he has the advantage, like the Prussians, that he's dealing with a homogeneous army. And really, this is something that's fairly new. I mean, it's been happening a bit in 1814, but if you think look at the Austerlitz campaign, the French army then, there are some Allied contingents, but it's overwhelmingly French, and the key units at the Battle of Austerlitz are French. And they've had time training at the Camp of Boulogne, all this, they've worked together. It's a very well-integrated team. Everybody well-drilled, well-trained, quite a lot of experience from earlier campaigns as well. Confident, capable, well-prepared, familiar with each other at all levels. Because of the pace of warfare, because of the casualties, and because of the expansion in size of Napoleon's armies, that gets diluted as time goes on. You lose a lot of people, and you add in more and more, even in your French, inverted commas, regiments, you get people who might consider themselves Dutch or Swiss or Belgian or Italian, let alone all the formal Allied contingents. You know, the army that goes into Russia in 1812 is incredibly disparate, and it's various different contingents. You know, it's one of those things. For, you know, you've got obviously the splendor of the uniforms in this period, but looking at that army, there's so many different people in different coloured uniforms. You know, Italians, all sorts of different German states, Confederation of the Rhine, Prussians and Austrians as well, Spanish regiment, Portuguese regiment, this sort of thing. It's very, very complicated, and no matter how good those units are individually, they don't have quite the same motivation as the French. They are not always treated very well by the French, so that and also they're much less experienced, because again, you're spreading out your experienced officers and NCOs, and inevitably, because they lead in a particularly brave and forward style, a lot of them get wounded and killed and get taken out. So your experience base is being eroded all the time, and you're spreading it out and you're diluting its impact. So there's an advantage by 1814, even though the troops are mainly inexperienced, you're coming back to a predominantly French army. And by 1815, that's true. You have the Poles of the Lancers of the Guard forming one squadron, attached to the Dutch regiment. It's called Dutch, but they're French by this time. You have a Swiss regiment that does take the field, and a few others dotted around in the armies that aren't part of l'Armée du Nord, that Napoleon leads into Belgium. But overwhelmingly, these are French regiments, and they are composed even more than before of people born and raised in France. You know, you haven't got the men who've been declared Frenchmen as the revolutionary government and then Napoleon expanded the borders of France. They've largely gone. So it's homogenous in that way, and whereas in 1813 and 1814 you'd be calling up classes of conscripts early, you'd been transferring people from naval artillery units, that sort of thing, turning them into infantry because you were so desperately short of that. In 1815 there is the advantage that lots of prisoners of war have come back home. So people who have served in the earlier campaigns and the earlier victories have come back from, you know, prison camps near Portsmouth, from the prison hulks. Many of them been held by the British, but others have been held by other nations and have been released. Now, many of them are none too keen on their former captors, so they're highly motivated. Quite a few of them are, before they were captured, experienced soldiers, and they're that much older, they're more mature. So that's all good. You could say, as people often do, that the army of 1815 is the most experienced army that Napoleon's had for a long time. But there are caveats to that, because again, he has to create this army that's been run down by the Bourbons, reorganize them, and there's the political element. You know, there is this uncertainty, particularly about more senior officers, how loyal they are. People who've worn the white cockade of the Bourbons, are they going to prove to be loyal? And of course you have the desertion of the Count de Beaumont, divisional commander, right at the beginning of the campaign, and a few other cases that lead to this sense that many of the men in the junior officers, the men in the ranks, do not trust the high command as well as they've had before. You've also got to think about these prisoners that have returned. Yes, they might have a real axe to grind against their former captors, which is good. Yes, they may have a lot of experience, but their most recent experience has been of years, in some cases quite a lot of years, of captivity. That's not great for physical fitness, training, let alone drill. And you're putting all these people together, you're bringing them up with the new recruits, with the men who've stayed all the way through, and you are trying to form coherent, organized, well-coordinated units where everybody knows everybody else, you know who's in charge, you're used to obeying them, you trust them. You have weeks to do that. Again, it's the fast pace of all this. Napoleon is trying to assemble an army. The raw material is probably better than he's had for a long time, but you can't just, again, flick a switch and turn these into superb veteran units that will operate together and be very efficient. You've got the same problem with commanders. You're bringing people in to command divisions and then army corps that are not like the divisions and corps of the heyday of the empire, where the same units and essentially the same team of officers at all ranks, both the staff and higher, stay together for a long time under the same commanders, operating together, get used to victory together. That all has to be improvised. The corps, the divisions, the brigades, the regiments, battalions even, in 1815 are much more recent creations. They're hurried, they're put together. It is harder to turn them into this experienced force. You know, this is not the army of 1805. If you'd given it a year or so's training, it might have become something like that, but it doesn't have that time. I think the biggest difference between this army and the ones of 1813 and even 1814, the cavalry have improved. They have been run down under the Bourbons, but not quite so much. They're better mounted, the troopers are better trained. Yes, you've brought in lots of recruits as well, and the cavalry tend to attract recruits more readily. You know, you have cases of people who've joined for the hussars and end up getting transferred to the infantry. And people are arriving at the very last minute and having to be equipped and having to be sent out. So the cavalry's better than it has been for a while. But again, probably with all these things, it's easier to get a company to start to cohere as a group because it's a smaller group, or a battalion or a regiment. The higher up you go, the harder it is to get that ability to work together and confidence in themselves as a group that comes with time, training and trust. It's always more complicated the higher up you go. It takes longer and there simply isn't time. So it's probably at the lower levels many of these units are good, but as you put them together they are more clumsy as they operate as brigades, as divisions, let alone as corps and as an army. So that's a problem. Again, this will improve if there is time, particularly if there's time, either time to train or time and you get successful campaigning, but it's not there. It isn't just an instant thing. So Napoleon is able to put together an army of 123,000 with 358 guns, very high proportion of artillery. Again, that's been a hallmark of the later campaigns. As the sort of the quality of the army dilutes, you use more and more guns to blast your way through the enemy, rather than the subtle manoeuvring that you see, for instance, at Austerlitz or Jena, or Stadt, those sorts of things where, you know, at divisional, brigade, regimental level, units are much more flexible, much more confident and capable. Mass has become a big thing since then. So coming back, if we think of our numbers, you know, 220, 230,000 combined for the Prussians and the Allied army of Wellington. Napoleon can't match their numbers. He's got, you know, in artillery he's getting closer, but he cannot match their numbers. So there are two real driving forces behind the strategy Napoleon adopts in the 100 Days when he drives into Belgium, which again, you know, Wellington and Blucher were thinking that in time, once their armies had gathered enough and more recruits come in, they would be invading France. They would be taking the initiative. It doesn't work out that way because of these factors. Napoleon knows that if he goes against Blucher and Wellington, he will be outnumbered. However, if he can fight them individually, then his army of 123,000 or so, he is confident will prove better than either of those armies individually. It'll have parity or perhaps a slight advantage in numbers depending on the circumstances, and quite possibly a big advantage in numbers on the spot if Napoleon can maneuver in the way that he feels confident that he can. But also it's homogeneous, it's confident, it's better. Yes, it's all rushed. Yes, the organization isn't perfect yet. It will take time, but he believes he can beat them individually. He cannot afford to fight them together. Together, their numbers will probably prevail. If he can fight them individually, he can beat them. There is, however, so that's the one time factor. It's get in fast while there are just these two armies, because the other big thing is that he knows there are more Prussians coming, there are Russians, there are Austrians, there will be others in time. So France is going to face invasion from several directions. It's going to face multiple armies, and then the numbers game will go even more against him. So he has a chance. He can take on Wellington and Blucher quickly and hope to defeat them quickly. And then if he can keep them separate, fight them when they're divided rather than concentrated. And the advantage is they're not going to be expecting him. His, there isn't a lot of warning as this coming. He's been able to control information going across the border reasonably well. And the Allied armies are dispersed because that's the only way you can feed armies in the long run. And of course, they don't know when he's coming or where he's coming or if he's coming. But one of the things that is easy to forget, within this strategy, Napoleon has to think of the longer game. He reckons he can beat Wellington and Blucher individually and take out that one threat, the most immediate threat to his position. But he knows that even if he does that, he's going to have to fight more battles and more campaigns because a lot more enemies are coming. And in many ways, these armies, the main Russian field army by this time is a pretty formidable thing. The best of the Prussians will be coming. The Austrians will be coming. There's a sense that the big struggles are actually after a campaign in the Low Countries against Blucher and Wellington. I remember back in 2015 doing on a panel, I think we were at Bradford or something like that, literary festival, really interesting session on Waterloo, the Napoleonic Wars and this sort of thing. And one of the other people there pointed out that in some respects, Waterloo is less important than we tend to think because it turns out it wins the war, but it didn't need to, because if Napoleon had won, there would still have been far more enemies to fight. And I think essentially the conclusion is that if Napoleon had won at Waterloo, or manoeuvred in a different way, that he'd won, defeated Wellington and Blucher separately in the course of several days at that time, he would have had to win more battles like that and fight more battles like that, another 3, 4, 5, 6, however many it might be, and keep on winning. He needed victories not like the victories of 1814, which tactically he could rout Allied armies, which he did on several occasions. He needed Austerlitz-Jena style victories. He needed to take an opponent out altogether. He couldn't just let them retreat and reform and come back, because ultimately the numbers are against him. So Napoleon needs the sort of decisive victories of the old days, but the campaign of the 100 Days is just a start from his point of view. If everything goes perfectly and he wins, then it's, okay, what's the next challenge? Now, because he loses, we focus on Waterloo, but that's how he thinks, and that's why he makes a lot of the decisions he makes. He's mobilized lots of troops. He doesn't take all of them with him to Belgium. He takes the pick of the bunch, very definitely. In terms of commanders, he does not take necessarily all of his best men with him. Now, Marshal Soult ends up as Chief of Staff because, well, Bessieres is dead. Who's going to run this? This is a very vital role for a large army like this and for the Napoleonic system. Soult is a very experienced marshal. He's been not so much successful on the battlefield, particularly at army level, but a great organizer, administrator, strategist, and good at moving and maneuvering, rather than necessarily at the nitty-gritty of fighting, or at least that's a suggestion from the Peninsular War. And he makes mistakes. Napoleon, after Waterloo, is very keen to emphasize, and Napoleon's supporters, that Marshal Soult makes lots of mistakes. Marshal Ney only arrives just as the campaign is beginning and is given command of one wing of the army. He arrives with just a single staff officer of his own. Now, we've been talking earlier about how the staffs at divisional, let alone corps level, and higher than that, haven't had time to gel together, to get to know each other, to work together as a team. And this is just human nature. It takes time to do this. Even with excellent material, even if everybody's really good at their job, they don't necessarily work well with each other right from the start. They have to learn to trust, to work, to know that, oh, that's the way you talk to so-and-so, because he'll do it there. That's how he'll be persuaded. If you do it this way, he'll get his back up and he'll be awkward and all this sort of thing. And you have to be confident in each other. Having half your army commanded by somebody who, although very experienced in the past, is new to these troops, new to these commanders, doesn't know them intimately, hasn't had a working up period with the corps and divisions under his command. That's far from ideal. And obviously people will criticize, and again, Napoleon was part of this, that Ney's decisions, Ney's mistakes lead to things. Now, Suchet is elsewhere. He's not with l'Armée du Nord. Davout, the bespectacled rather cold but very capable Marshal is not there. He's Minister of War. And people have often said, well, why aren't they there? If they were there, Davout wouldn't have made the mistakes that Ney made, or he would have been a better chief of staff, Suchet would be a better battlefield commander. They're not there because Napoleon's got to think ahead. If he wins, if he puts all his cards on the table and wins in Belgium, then he's not necessarily in the best position to face the next challenge and the next challenge. And Napoleon needs to keep on winning. Any major defeat and it's probably over for him. So he's got to win and win big time after time after time, which means thinking ahead. So having Davout to organize your war effort is a really smart move because he is very capable and he does a lot in an incredibly short time. One of the reasons the army is so efficient when it goes into Belgium and well organized, well equipped, is because of the efforts of Davout. Suchet will deal with one of the, an Austrian invasion elsewhere. Again, you can't win in Belgium but lose the war elsewhere. So what Napoleon does is pretty logical and makes sense as long as you see it as part of this longer game, this longer conflict that he knows he has to fight and win if he's going to win out overall. Because simply, if he'd won on the 18th of June at Mont Saint Jean and the Prussians felt too weak and had either been beaten or had retreated afterwards, there was more to do. That wasn't the end of it. That was simply stage one. Then you've got to go on to stage two and you've got to win big there again, and probably stage 3 and 4 and so on. He's gambling on the fact he can win enough big victories that eventually the great powers of Europe will decide that it's not worth the effort fighting him, that they can compromise. It's a huge gamble. It's typically Napoleon. It's typically thinking that I can win big and that somehow I can make this happen. But it is difficult. It is impractical. So when Napoleon attacks, he has to move fast, he has to move quickly, he has to try and keep Wellington and Blucher apart and beat each of them individually. And early on, things seem to be going quite well. He does take them by surprise on the 15th of June when the French cross the border, in the Prussian sector mainly. The Prussians start to pull together. The Prussian army organizes and reacts faster. Again, it's a sense of this more coherent system, the fact that it is this homogeneous army. And yeah, for what I've said earlier, the staff work is probably already improving significantly from things in the past. Wellington's staff work is not as good as it had been in the Peninsular War because he hasn't got the same people everywhere at every level. So there are mistakes, there is confusion. So Napoleon drives in. Wellington has been thinking all the way through that Napoleon would do what Wellington would do if he were in Napoleon's shoes. So he sees his main vulnerability is the connection with the sea and always thinks it's his left flank. Napoleon will go to the left, to the west, around Wellington's right flank, head towards Mons, cut Wellington off from supplies, cut him off from the sea, and that's there. That's what he thinks he would do. That's his greatest weakness, and therefore he expects Napoleon to exploit that. So, as he says famously, he's humbugged me. He does get it wrong. He misreads the situation, and then it's a question of trying to react in far less than ideal circumstances as orders go out for the army to concentrate. The Allied army of Wellington does this more slowly, more clumsily than the Prussians do. Blucher is able to not all his army, but a large part of it at Ligny by the 16th to fight a major battle. He expected, Wellington rode over to see him, the British would arrive, but the Allies aren't going to get there because Ney has moved up and you'll have the confrontation at Quatre. A smaller battle, significantly smaller than Ligny, but nevertheless important. And only possible because on the 15th of June, in the evening, a Dutch-Belgian divisional commander, followed by Rebec, Prince of Orange Chief of Staff, had ignored Wellington's armies to move and had kept troops at Quatre and occupied it and directed more to go there to reinforce it, denied that crossroads to the French. If the French had got that, they would have been able to focus more troops on the Prussians at Ligny. Wellington's army would still be straggling everywhere. And the chances of Ligny being a much bigger French victory would drastically have increased. And that would have left Wellington in a difficult situation. Because if the Prussians had been taken out in one battle, then Wellington did not have enough troops to face the French on his own. Again, it comes back to that basic thing. But Allied plans to work together don't come to fruition. Occasionally you get these weird, wacky conspiracy ideas that Wellington's letting the Prussians bleed for him, all this sort of thing. It's far more to do with lack of preparedness and lack of competence, really. This is not the slick army that's existed in the past. It's partly Wellington's deep belief. He really was convinced Napoleon would do something else, so he is wrong-footed. You have, the famous Duchess of Richmond's ball where Wellington's issuing orders from there, but it wasn't quite as grand an affair as it is in the movie and in a lot of people's imagination, and there were lots of officers who weren't invited. The army is starting to move by then, but it's again, it's a demonstration of confidence, because deep down Wellington has expressed his doubts about the loyalty of the Belgians. Napoleon has organised a depot area to receive Belgian deserters so that they can be reorganised and put into the French ranks, because so many of them have been fighting for him until quite recently. There's a handful, it's a trickle, it's nowhere near. Most Belgians have actually decided that they're Belgians and they'll fight in a Belgian regiment for Belgium. They're not quite too sure about the Kingdom of the Netherlands at this point, but nevertheless they didn't feel they were treated well enough by the French to rush back into their arms. But you can understand everybody on both sides expecting that to happen. And with this, because Wellington has organised these army corps but then jumbles them all together, even the organisation didn't turn them into the sort of army corps that the French have in this year, let alone the very slick, well-organised forces they've had in the past. So on the 16th of June, Blücher is defeated in a pounding match at Ligny. So it's a very brutal fight. It's one of those unsubtle later period Napoleonic battles where you pound your way through and then you break the enemy that way. A lot of brute force. Partly this is again a question of time. Napoleon needs to win this battle quickly because it's his whole strategy is to fight Blücher and Wellington individually. So now he's got Blücher on his own. He's got to fight him and beat him quickly. There isn't time to be too subtle. In the meantime, Marshal Ney, with one corps plus heavy cavalry division and some other bits and pieces, is fighting at Quatre, a battle that develops during the day. It's much smaller than Ligny. Troops arrive for the Allies, are gradually fed in and stave off succession of French. The numbers are on the French side at the start. Eventually they will turn into Wellington's favour. But it takes time, and the Allies lack artillery. Because units aren't where even the Brunswick artillery doesn't seem to get there, and this sort of thing. Picton's division comes up with British and Hanoverian troops just at the point where the Nassauers, Dutch, Belgians, others have been pretty much worn out. Again, remember, these are very inexperienced troops, and you even have one battalion that's equipped with French muskets and only has 10 rounds of ammunition per man, and because you couldn't use British ammunition in French muskets, what are these blokes supposed to do? Again, it's a sign of everything being improvised, everything being done last minute, and not yet. This isn't a coherent army. It does remarkably well. The great moment for the Dutch Belgians is probably at Quatre on the 15th and 16th. That's when their role is decisive, because if they hadn't stood there, if their commanders hadn't put them there, and if then the troops hadn't fought well enough to hold that position, then nothing could have happened afterwards. There would not have been a Waterloo in the way it happens. You could argue, as Napoleon later did, that if Ney had pushed harder and more aggressively, then they wouldn't have got the chance, and maybe that's also true. But again, the fellow's only been here for a matter of hours when he arrives. He doesn't know his people, and seems to be in a state. There's a story, one account of him galloping around at Quatre, shouting out, is there no bullet for me, at one point. He's probably not the right man for the job at this point, but there isn't a lot of choice. Napoleon's campaigns have killed off or worn out all his experienced commanders of the early days. They're dead, or they're just not up to it anymore. And the big failure for the French is that d'Erlon's corps, First Corps, spends its time, marching to Ligny. Ney thought it was under his command, which it was, but there's been confused staff work, conflicting messages going to it, summons them to Quatre, and then they're summoned back to Ligny. Their approach confuses Napoleon, because for a while he's not sure what nationality they are. Are they allies coming to help the Prussians? So delays the attack, which slows down the battle. Had they arrived at Ligny or at Quatre, this extra 20 to 30,000 troops, particularly at Ligny, where they quite possibly would have arrived on the flank of the Prussians, surely would have been decisive, would have won the battle for the French. But instead they march between the two and don't get involved at all. So again, it's a failure, but it's like the failures of the Allied army to concentrate. It's like some of the Prussian units are late as well for Ligny. These are inexperienced armies. Mistakes tend to happen where your staff isn't well practiced, isn't well organized, and you're inexperienced. You're learning as you go along, and you make a lot of mistakes. And you didn't expect the French to turn up. So on all sides, it's the classic thing of war. It's he who makes fewest mistakes. It's all very well going on about, oh, this is so stupid. They shouldn't have done this. It's obvious this should have happened. Well, making those good things happen is the really hard part. Having the idea, it's General Wavel's comment, or Field Marshal Wavel's comment about principles of strategy and tactics are absurdly simple. It's the actualities of war that are difficult. It's what you actually know on the time, the decisions made by these tired, hungry individuals with limited knowledge, limited visibility, and that make things happen, that create that friction. We're getting back to Clausewitz again. So Napoleon wins a battle and inflicts heavy losses on the Prussians at Ligny, forces them to retreat. Blücher leads a cavalry charge, falls from his horse, is ridden over. Things seem to be working, and Napoleon will send Marshal Grouchy again. Formerly he's commanded the reserve cavalry, again because you haven't got Murat, you haven't got these famous commanders of earlier years. He's doing something he hasn't had to do before, with people who don't necessarily know and like him. And think even back to the heyday of Napoleon's army, the marshals were a very prickly bunch. They didn't always get on, and they would bicker, and they didn't always help each other as much as they could. Everything is magnified by this point. They're less experienced, they're less capable, they're less respected. However, Blücher retreats. Napoleon is hoping he can keep the Prussians separate from Wellington's Allied army while he goes on and destroys Wellington's army. So enough of the strategy is working. I've taken out the Prussians, at least for the moment. It hasn't been the knockout blow that I hoped for, but it's still been bad. Now I can turn on Wellington and sort out his mishmash of an army. On the 17th, the Allies are retreating. Blücher retreats in a way that allows him to keep contact with Wellington, and then gives the promise that he will march to Wellington's aid if Wellington fights on the next day, the 18th, at the Mont Saint-Jean position south of Waterloo. It's a position Wellington has known about. It's interesting, some of the stuff that Gareth Glover has come across, that there was an idea at one point of partly fortifying this with redoubts and putting siege artillery in early on. It doesn't happen, things move far too fast, and this was a point when this was a possible battlefield. But again, it's not quite the image we get of Wellington, the Peninsula War. This strikes much more Kutuzov at Borodino sort of thing. So it's interesting that they're playing with those ideas. The French pursue, but they take a while to pursue on the 17th. There are probably quite a lot of stragglers from the Allied army. It's very difficult to know the numbers that are there for Waterloo itself, but because some people only keep records, some of the nations only keep records for the whole campaign anyway. So you don't know who's been lost at Quatre, who's deserted, who's been dispersed. Some people retreat and keep on retreating. Best estimates, I suppose, are Wellington at Waterloo has about 73,000 men. So significant drop from the 112,000 at the start of the campaign. Some of this is casualties, some of this is troops that need to be garrisoned elsewhere, some of this is he's still deeply concerned about his right flank, that Napoleon is going to come around that way. So there is this large force that doesn't take part in the battle to cover that eventuality. He expects to be outflanked, partly because I think whenever he's faced somebody like Massena in the Peninsular War, that's what he's tended to try and do. And Wellington is going on that experience. This is what the French do. Napoleon, you can expect even more from him than you can from his best marshals. So, and again, it comes back to this, well, this is what I would do. I wouldn't go head on. I'd try and go around the side and strike at the, move out of position that way. Napoleon doesn't, because Napoleon, again, doesn't have the time and also doesn't really respect Wellington or the Allied army. He thinks it's such a mishmash that he can pound his way through very quickly, and then Brussels is the prize. It's good for the newspapers to report that we've captured a major city like that. So Wellington has 73,000 men, about 53,850 infantry, 13,350 odd cavalry, about 157 guns, the rocket troop as well, that plays a small role in things, 5,000 or so artillery. These are figures, I've taken these from Mark Adkin's Waterloo Companion, which is, again, he's very thorough, and his best guesses are probably almost as good as most people's best guesses. Napoleon, to face them, has 77,000 men, so a slight advantage, but not a massive one. 53,400 infantry, 15,600 or so cavalry, 6,500 or so gunners, 246 guns. A lot more guns. A significant advantage in cavalry. And another thing to emphasize in this is the type of cavalry. Wellington has 2 brigades of British heavies, the Household Brigade and the Union Brigade. You've also got the Dutch and the Belgian Carabineers as another brigade. But basically there are 3 brigades of what you could count as heavy cavalry. Napoleon has divisions of cuirassiers. That's something new. The British have not really fought them before. We'll come back to that in a moment. But the bulk of Wellington's cavalry, even the British contingent, are light dragoons, hussars, this sort of thing. Now, the British tend to be better mounted than their equivalents in other armies, but nevertheless they are supposedly not designed to be main battlefield cavalry. Their role is more in scouting, pursuit, patrolling, keeping the enemy back, this sort of thing. That's not the role they're going to be playing at Waterloo. They will have to play this battlefield role, but they will be up against, on the whole, heavier French cavalrymen. You've also got the cavalry of the Guard, which is very strong. So Napoleon, it's not just the numbers, but the type of cavalry he has is significantly heavier than Wellington's. You could also argue, as meant to prove that they're more disciplined, more coordinated, they've got that confidence. But again, we'll come back to that in a moment. Blucher, only part of the army will arrive at Waterloo. Some of it will be fighting Grouchy at Wavre. So estimate is about 49,000 will get to Waterloo, but that's including people who get there very late in the day. And even the early contingents don't arrive till the battle's been on for several hours because they've got a long way to go. The probability is that had the positions been reversed, Wellington's army would have got fewer men to Waterloo. To reinforce Blucher. Again, it comes back to the advantage of a rather better staff, a more homogeneous army, and perhaps the personality of Blucher as well. It does tend to get people moving. The Prussians get there with more men than one suspects that Wellington might have managed if the situation had been reversed. That's fortune, really, rather than anything else, but it plays on the Allies' side. Of the people who get there, about 38,000 are infantry, 7,000 cavalry, 2,500 artillery, 134 guns. But remember, much of this arrives very late. But it does mean that as the day goes on, once the Prussians arrive, the numbers will shift inexorably against Napoleon, and to a degree where he is probably not going to be able to take this on. So again, it's why there isn't any manoeuvre around either flank of Wellington's positions. Napoleon goes pretty bullheaded straight at it. Time for him is the critical thing. He's got to beat Wellington before the Prussians arrive. He doesn't know the Prussians are coming, but they might be. So he's got to win quickly, and it comes back to this whole campaign needs to be done quickly. It needs to be done as decisively as possible. Take out these armies so they're no longer a factor, win some victories, improve morale at home, secure the loyalty of the French people, and be ready to do this again when the next lot of invaders come along to face you. Wellington fights at Waterloo because Blucher has pledged to come and aid him. With just his own troops, he was not confident of facing Napoleon and winning. And you have to look at the performance. He's probably right, given how close things come to the line being broken. Had the Prussians not arrived, this would surely have been an Allied defeat. How bad a defeat? Possible to see. Was it under Ligny, where a lot of the army would have got away? On the other hand, easier to hold together the homogeneous Prussian army than it is to hold together this very disparate Allied unit with lots and lots of very inexperienced soldiers. If you read the story of Waterloo, there's a tendency, and it comes back to this sort of classic narrative of the battle that's created really a Victorian thing. It breaks it down into phases, it simplifies things. So you begin with the attack on Hougoumont by French First Corps, or at least by a division of that gradually sucks in more troops. And then that's supposed to draw Wellington's attention to that flank. Then First Corps, d'Erlon's Corps, the people who've spent the day shuffling between Ligny and Quatre on the 16th, not got to either. They launch a major attack at the eastern end of Wellington's line, which is less heavily defended than the western area. Again, Wellington is focused on this threat to his right flank and puts more troops there. He has completely forgotten the corps system by now, and even to some extent some of the divisional systems within the Allied contingent. So they are dotted around, and you have Picton's division, Byland's brigade, Hanoverians on the eastern half of the battlefield, to the east of La Haye-de-Saône on the ridge behind it. These are all troops that have fought at Quatre and suffered very heavily. The Byland's brigade in particular, they held out for a long time. They did very well, given that these are inexperienced troops. It's an awful lot to expect them to take on the French again in a major attack. But several of the battalions of Picton's division that are experienced British troops have at least a corps of Peninsular War veterans. These battalions have suffered heavy losses, in some cases almost 50%, just 2 days before. So there aren't the numbers here. You have the big question, this peculiar formation adopted by d'Erlon's Corps, where battalions are deployed in line with another battalion line behind and behind. This sort of, you form columns of lines effectively. Nobody quite seems to posthumously want to admit who gave the order for this. However, these things are quite tightly controlled. The space occupied by units is important. It does matter. So it's at least at corps level, and it's probably come down from Napoleon, or at least at army headquarters, to do this. The attack is a serious one. Some of the units, some of the Belgian militia units that have been badly mauled do collapse. Most of Byland's brigades retreats. Some of it rallies and comes back to the fighting line. The two brigades, Pack and Kempt of Picton's division, go forward, become heavily involved. There is a pretty vicious firefight. Picton is killed early on. Some of the Hanoverians are very inexperienced troops, not able to do much to support this. You can argue whether the French are on the brink of succeeding, of breaking through, or whether they are being held, but the thing is turned around when the Union Brigade of British Heavy Cavalry and the Household Brigade attack, drive off the cuirassiers supporting d'Erlon's Corps, and break the main components of the attack. The French units are unable to form square. They don't react quickly. They're ridden down. It's one of those things where everything favours the cavalrymen. Classically, the British cavalry then get too excited, go too far. French cavalry come in, lancers from the corps, and perhaps other reserve troops coming up as well, chasseurs, to chase the British back. British light cavalry go in to try and help the heavy cavalry retreat, succeed, go too far, get mauled. Belgian cavalry helps to bring in the British, but the Union Brigade and the Household Brigade are drastically reduced in size as a result of it. They achieve a lot, they break this attack, but they are far less significant force for the rest of the day, and the bulk of Wellington's British heavy cavalry have gone in this. They've done a lot. You then have the phases of bombardment. This will lead to the big French cavalry attacks, mostly to the west of La Haye-de-Saône, later in the afternoon, that begin, it's the whole, in the movie, it's Wellington's retreating, Milhau, follow me. The extent to which repositioning, moving back behind the reverse slope has been misinterpreted by the French. It's a big attack by cavalry that sucks in more things. It's probably a reflection of, yes, these units are big, impressive, but they are also inexperienced, again, at this higher level. as you go up, you can make a regiment that's quite efficient relatively quickly. To make a brigade is harder, a division harder again, a corps harder than that. More troops probably get sucked in. There's an excitement to it all, ending up to the point where horses as herd animals are just going forward because everybody wants to run. The attacks on the British and Allied squares, and a few units that don't form square because they're not capable of it, but they're far enough back. The careful manoeuvring there are, there's a couple of cases where the 73rd, for instance, at one point, there seem to be some French break into the square, but they're forced out again. On the whole, none of the squares are just ridden down. This is not broken. There are defeats. There are Allied infantry units that are destroyed. One of the Hanoverian regiments early on, when the Prince of Orange sends it to relieve La Haye-de-Saône, caught in the open. Others, perhaps, and bear in mind, there are French accounts of riding down squares and all this sort of thing, but it's probably too confusing. They're more likely to be catching people that have been one of these formations and one of these other incidents rather than actually doing it. The odds are the French as well didn't really know which troops they were facing when they were reaching the ridge, because to pay close attention to what uniform they're wearing is, there's a lot more going on when people are shooting at you, and there's a lot of excitement. Add to the fact the Hanoverian uniform is very, very close to the British, that telling them apart would be difficult. But it doesn't succeed. It doesn't break Wellington's army. You could say there's a logic to it. You don't have a lot of infantry spare at the moment. Time is of the essence. So you think this army is pretty shaky. Attack it with your heavies, and maybe you can barge your way through as you've done at Eylau. It can happen. It can work. It's logical. If Napoleon, would later blame Ney for doing this, he doesn't stop him. And seems to commit more troops to it. So it might be one of those things. Later you'll have the capture of La Haye-de-Saône, leading ultimately to the attack of the Imperial Guard and the defeat of the Imperial Guard. That's the sort of the British-based story, or the Allied-based story of it. Obviously you've had the Prussians starting to arrive as the afternoon goes on, Lobau's corps being diverted to Plassenois, more and more troops being sucked in there, though again the French hold off for quite a while, because when we talk about the Prussians arriving, remember that this is a column that's marching, so not everybody from a division or a Prussian brigade rather, or a corps, arrives at the same time. In the same way, there are French troops that arrive at Waterloo during the course of the day, that have been following the Allied army, but at a distance on the 17th and haven't got to the position. So people are arriving. It's it comes back to this thing, oh, this army marched into so-and-so, the entire army is there. It doesn't work like that. The story of the battle broken down into those phases has an element of truth to it, but it is far too simplistic. You can see this just by reading the personal accounts, going back to Cyborn's collection of them and others. That's not how people remember the battle. There are these big moments, but they tend to remember lots more individual and local attacks, fighting going on at different stages. And yes, this is partly the confusion of individuals' perspective, but we've imposed a rather artificial order and a simplistic order on the whole thing that doesn't reflect the complicated reality. A couple of things to point out really about the battle. So we can't go into it in great detail. Napoleon needed to win quickly, so that helps to explain the aggression of the attacks. D'Erlon's assault is not subtle. Letting more people get involved in Hougoumont can be seen as, oh, well, that's, the French are wasting man. But on the other hand, they pin a large part of Wellington's army as well to support that. And, the number that go into Hougoumont itself significantly increased, but the number that are brought forward to support that also matters. The grinding attrition inflicted by the French artillery is a noticeable feature. Again, all the Allied accounts talk about being under bombardment again and again during the battle. They're worn down. And yes, there was a reverse slope, but even there, you're not entirely safe. Some balls will come running through, and more of the army gets lured forward or sucked forward because it has to occupy that position. You have, for instance, the brigade, including the 52nd, the 71st, that's brought forward. Is it Adams' brigade? No, I can't remember off the top of my head. Again, this is something Gareth Glover has discovered, is brought forward by Clinton quite early onto the front slope as basically a breakwater. There's a sense where you're better troops can be in square or in four deep line in the intervals between the cavalry attacks to break up, disrupt the French cavalry so that by the time they're hitting some of your less experienced troops in your second and third line, the French are not coming in such an organised way that they really can threaten to ride down the Brunswickers or some of the Hanoverians and Belgians and others that are very, very raw troops, have been in service a matter of months, not that well trained, don't have the confidence to know that if they stay together they will win. They start to gain that, but this is the first battle for so many of them. And it's a pretty appalling pounding match. So, of course, units are more vulnerable. And you have, the classic case being the Enniskillen's 27th Foot that don't really encounter French infantry to any great extent, are in square for a lot of the day and suffer the worst losses proportionally of any of Wellington's units. And the idea you could see them lying down dead in square afterwards. Some would have been wounded, but the French artillery is doing its job. And again, this is a race against time. Can it wear down the Allies quickly enough that Napoleon can win and break through before enough Prussians arrive to make a difference? He's fairly economical with the troops that are sent to hold the Prussians back at Plassenois. The focus remains on trying to break Wellington's army. So although you get your weakest infantry corps is sent there, then you get a young guard division, eventually you get a couple of regiments of old guard, are they old or middle? Which doesn't matter. And it's interesting, some of the accounts from those guardsmen describe how even units like that going into the built-up area break down into skirmishers and the battalion coherence goes very quickly. And you end up with, yes, they're all fighting out there somewhere, but you can't possibly reorganize them into a group that can attack again. The French cavalry attacks don't succeed, but they make more sense. There is a logic behind them than some of the sort of old accounts. And, some of the British comments of, oh, here come those damn fools again. As time passed, the squares got more and more confident, and it was a relief when the cavalry attacked because you couldn't be bombarded so much. But again, remember, Napoleon's got this strong cavalry force, and he's never been somebody to hold back and spare the horseflesh if there was a chance of winning. Come back to this point about the weight of cavalry. The British Army hasn't really faced cuirassiers before. In the Peninsular War, you had a provisional regiment committed earlier on, which later becomes the 13th Cuirassiers. They serve mainly in the southeast. There is some contact with Murray's expedition, the Tarragona campaign. But basically speaking, in one of the novels I have a company of cuirassiers. French had companies rather than troops in there. Two of those make up a squadron. I got this into the story. That's fiction, because it was more dramatic and this sort of thing. But on the whole, the British had faced dragoons and then chasseurs, hussars, lancers later on, the Poles first of all, and then eventually some others. They hadn't come up against cuirassiers, and the cuirassiers really did stick in people's memory. In the memoirs, they're very, very prominent. Now, they're not necessarily on bigger horses than the very well-mounted British heavy cavalry, but bear in mind, most of your heavy cavalry is used up early on in the fighting. And although people sort of mocked the cuirassiers and how they'd get rid of their armour as soon as they were dismounted and all this sort of thing to get away, there are signs that the light cavalry in particular struggled to deal with them. And you have some fairly vague, veiled comments by Uxbridge that rather implies that even some of the British units proved reluctant to face them as the day wore on. And this is partly because the French cavalry keep coming. And yes, you're waiting until they've been disordered by the squares, they're dispersed, they're less formed, and then you hit them with your light cavalry to drive them back. But you're doing that again and again and again. And a lot of inexperienced units. The same thing's clearly happening with the Dutch and the Belgians and the Brunswick Light Cavalry and all this sort of thing. They're being asked to go up against people heavier than themselves, bigger men on bigger horses, who have the confidence of that as well. There's a sense the cuirassiers, they don't have elite companies in their regiments, they get the red plume and all this sort of thing, that they are a picked elite. This is part of the French army that
Wellington hasn't faced before and Wellington's men haven't faced before. You could say the same about the weight of artillery. You know, armies in the peninsula, although the French relied a lot on their guns, because of the nature of campaigning there, didn't have this many before. Concentrated, Waterloo is a very narrow battlefield, so you've got a lot of firepower, you've got the weight of the cavalry coming. This is new and it's a struggle. And, you know, Wellington's damn near run thing comment, you do feel, the more you look at the sources, this is really, really close. It wouldn't have taken more. If the Prussians had been an hour later with fewer people, then eventually the Allied army might have been worn down. There's an interesting book by Andrew Field about the non-British contingents at Waterloo and in the campaign. And one of his main arguments is that most of them did remarkably well, given how recently recruited they were, how relatively little training they'd been given, but that they could cope with skirmishing with the French, they could cope with standing in square or column and facing off the cavalry. When French infantry assaulted, they tended to give way, because that's a really hard thing to do, and to stand up to that level of determination. You know, most of the army, the majority, are these sorts of inexperienced troops. So it takes, as Wellington, you know, not a modest man anyway, but nevertheless, that sense that, you know, I don't think it would have done if I wasn't there. The amount he does, the activity, the fact that virtually everybody seems to have seen him, that he appears everywhere, that he deals with the small detail, that he's encouraging them, and the, you know, the appalling loss rate amongst his staff. It beat the odds that he wasn't killed or wounded during this battle. So Napoleon could have won. Whether the losses would have been not so serious, perhaps, you know, if rejoining with Grouchy, he could then have taken on what was left of Blucher and defeated him. There is a possibility that the French could have won this campaign. It is very closely fought. It relies on Wellington keeping his army there in place and keeping on fighting for long enough, and the quality of all those troops, even the inexperienced ones, that they just manage to keep going. And it's in things like that where you can say, well, you know, the Prince of Orange does play his part in inspiring people, and many other commanders. The fact that the men who'd served in the French army proved very loyal and generally pretty good, kept these inexperienced troops there. The leadership amongst the British as well kept them there, and they kept on fighting, and there was enough left to, after you defeated the Imperial Guard, which again, you know, is fairly close. There's yes, you look and think, well, these numbers wise this isn't vast, but lots of other French units are coming forward as well in support. Everybody tends to focus on just the Guard units, but it's very clear that there are others coming. And you've got, you know, brigades that have simply been worn down to the point where they can't really hold on much longer. It is very, very close. But they win, and they win because all the different Allied contingents play their part, because Wellington deploys them in a way that allows that to happen, that doesn't put too much stress on the weaker components, that tries to sort of leaven everything with his more capable, more experienced units, and holds off. There are mistakes, there are you know, very close moments, but they hold off, and the battle is won because Blucher arrives with enough men early enough to mean that Napoleon has to divert troops away, and the numbers eventually turn against them, and then the French collapse. And that the brittleness of the French army comes when the Guard does break. You know, la Garde recule, and so much of the army does fight. Not, you know, entirely. There are some units that stay together and fight their way out, but an awful lot of it collapses, and then you get the Allied advance meeting up with the Prussians. So there's a lot more to it than that. It's a complicated, fascinating story. It's made all the more exciting because there are so many good personal accounts. We can see the detail in this. We can have a sense of what so many of these men were like, who they were, why they were fighting, how they were fighting, the chaos of it all. Although nobody really knows it at the time, Waterloo is the decisive moment of the campaign. Napoleon retreats, the Allies will advance. As they push into France, you start to get some of the other armies will come as well. They don't know that they're expecting to, you know, there are some sieges, there is more fighting, but Napoleon has been discredited. This was his throw of the dice, and he needed to win at this role, defeat Blucher and Wellington separately, and then be ready to face the next one and the next one. Instead, he doesn't quite defeat, he does defeat Blucher, but not as badly as he wanted. Blucher is able to recover, Blucher is able to join Wellington, Wellington is able to hold out long enough for Blucher to do this. Waterloo is an Allied victory. You know, you could say Blucher's suggestion, they call it the Battle of la Belle Alliance, as a moment. It's got to be seen as that Allied, because even Wellington's army is predominantly not British, but also he fights at that position because Blucher has said he's coming, and the battle is won because the Prussians do come. So it would be wrong to say that the Prussians win the war, because it's again, if the Allies hadn't held on, then Blucher would have been in a very exposed situation with his army spread out and facing the bulk of Napoleon on their own. So it's an Allied victory, but if Napoleon had won, and you know he could have done this is not inevitable, he would have had to go on and win more victories, more struggles like this. Whether, again, it comes back to, you know, what's the health of Napoleon, what's the ability. He's not quite the man he had been in 1805. He's, you know, like Wellington in his 46th year, but he's showing signs of his age and responsibility more. After all, he's been head of an empire. You know, Wellington is a general, carries a lot of responsibility, but it's not quite the same thing. And there isn't quite the personality cult Napoleon has created around himself, where everything depends on him and every failure is his failure. In the same way that every success is his success. So it remains an incredibly dramatic story, because there are few wars decided as quickly as this one. If Napoleon had won, it would have gone on much longer. And it isn't quite as simple. You know, we tend to focus on the 15th to the 18th, sometimes, if we're generous, the 19th of June. Just those few days. There is more to it than that. You know, people don't know this is all over, but they start to, as Napoleon's support falls off, he can't rally more people, and the numbers now have just turned against him. Basically, his gamble hasn't paid off, and it takes a little while before he accepts that fact, and before it becomes plain to him that he has no choice but to accept that fact. And then people start to realise that Waterloo meant so much, made such a difference. From a British perspective, brings in 100 years of peace. You know, there are, and in terms of major continental wars, there is nothing like it. You know, even the Franco-Prussian War isn't quite on the scale of the Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, or before them the 7 Years' Wars, and other. Till you get to the First World War, everybody goes, you know, bigger and more horrendous. If you look at population sizes in the Napoleonic era, that period, admittedly, it's 20 odd years of war rather than 1914 to 1418, but the losses suffered during that time are on the same sort of scale as losses in the First World War. It's just the population has got a lot bigger, and it happens a lot quicker and in a more industrialized way. But there's a sense, you know, you can see a link between, for all the gaudiness of the uniforms at Waterloo, even if they were covered in mud, bombardment, attrition, of that, you know, there's almost a progression to what you're going to get a century later. But this is a couple of lessons from it. One is that the French army in 1815 isn't the French army of 1805, but the Allied armies it's facing, they're not the armies that had been so good right late in the war and the defeat of Napoleon, but they've still learnt a lot. The advantage the French have tactically, strategically in the early days has greatly reduced as people learn how you do things. You know, the Prussians in particular have looked, studied, thought about this and worked out this is how we beat it. Each of the armies really has found its own way of dealing with that revolutionary fervour, the manoeuvring of the revolutionary and the Napoleonic armies in the early days that had won such great victories. It's a bit like in the Second World War, you know, the Wehrmacht can do blitzkrieg in 40, 41, occasionally in 42, but it gets much, much harder. People learn how to deal with it. It isn't a surprise in the same way that it was, and you start to think, well, I don't need to panic, I don't need to quit, I can keep fighting and maybe I can beat them. That and the increase in size of armies, even, you know, the 100 Days ones are not the biggest armies around, and they're not, this is not Leipzig, but you dilute the quality, so you have less capable armies, but generally the military systems have become more and more close in terms of their capacities. So again, Napoleon does have the best army in the Waterloo campaign, but the numbers are against him. There are things the enemy can do better than the French can. And that stubbornness, that ability of the British, particularly the British infantry, to stand up to the French in close combat and defeat them, which others have learnt as well, but it's not something you learn quickly, and it's not something that many of the Allied contingents have yet reached that stage. That's vital. Without that, then Napoleon probably would have won. This would have been the breakfast, the picnic, he predicts, on the morning of Waterloo, which is partly raising morale of his men, but it does seem to reflect his sense that Wellington's a bad general, the British are bad troops. He does seem to believe that, and there's an element of truth in some of this. So anyway, I think this has turned into a far longer talk than I planned it was. I was aiming for an hour, and we've obviously gone far beyond that. So, like Napoleon, I have failed to make best use of the time, and I haven't succeeded. But there will be more. We'll probably do more talks on other periods at various stages. Channel's always going to be predominantly ancient world, and particularly Roman, but it's nice to do other things, because I think the more history you study, the more you think and talk about, the better you understand any specific period. A broader sense of the range of possibilities, ways of thinking about things, is always worth it. So that's it anyway. My thoughts on the Waterloo campaign for today, the 210th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. Thanks for watching.